Hello and welcome to my new video. I am trying out this video format mainly because this next essay was one that required having some video evidence, some video clips in it, and I wanted to make sure that that was accessible and available to people. So, here we are. So, it's been a rough couple of weeks. With the attack in Colorado Springs and with the Elon's takeover of Twitter, meaning that a lot of transphobes are feeling much more empowered. It's become much clearer that the argument about transness, about trans identity, is not so much about the science anymore, but more bigotry. It's just straight up bigotry. It always has been, but now it's more mask off bigotry. But one thing I do want to cover is that the conservative argument against trans people has always been about feelings, has always been based in the sort of ick factor of feelings. But the arguments that they make, they proclaim to be rational and logical and all these things about, we have the facts. Facts don't care about your feelings, as Ben Shapiro likes to say. But that's not actually true for the arguments that they make. And that's what today's video is about. They don't actually make fact-based arguments. They make emotional appeals. Most of their arguments are appeals to emotion, are appeals to things that are not logical, not rational, and not based in science. So in order to examine how the conservative way of argumentation, the conservative rhetoric, is about emotion rather than facts or science or logic, I'm going to look at two separate examples. The first being Steven Crowder from Louder with Crowder, who tries very hard to be one of those rational, open-minded, you can change my mind with science, people who doesn't actually want to have his mind changed, doesn't care about having his mind changed. He cares about appearing like that, rather than actually being so. And the second, of course, is our favorite conservative theocratic fascist, Matt Walsh. So, Steven Crowder is perhaps best known for his change my mind stunts, where he wants to seem open-minded while actually refusing to let his mind be changed by facts or science. This is something that's been true about him for years now. That's a whole nother post. Today we're going to examine his debunking of John Oliver's piece on transition in minors and how they set it up and how he attempts to debunk it. The one aspect that we really want to focus in on here is something that I notice a lot of commentators doing in conservative spaces, and that is what I'm calling the Parasocial You. So whenever you're engaged in consuming the content of a creator and regularly viewing them and becoming a fan of them, you can develop this thing called the parasocial relationship. It is this idea that you know a whole lot about this person because they're telling you a lot about their lives, you're seeing them on your computer screen, they're with you when you're preparing dinner, blah, blah, blah. There are some ways in which this parasocial relationship can be really good. For example, with the Try Guys, Keith Habersberger does a series called Eat the Menu, where he just eats through different restaurant menus and stuff. And a lot of people who are recovering from eating disorders have mentioned that having him on and eating at the same time as them helps them develop this sort of like buddy system that is needed sometimes in eating disorder recovery. It makes them feel like they have a friend who's there who can eat with them and normalize the consumption of food in their brain. So that's one way in which the parasocial can actually be pretty good. Keith doesn't know that you're sitting, well, he does now, but Keith doesn't know really that you're sitting down and eating stuff with him in order to, like, have this help with recovery, but it is part of what happens when you have that parasocial relationship. That's a good way of doing it. But there's also ways that it can turn bad, and we see that a lot with celebrities, where, like, people identify so much with a celebrity and with a parasocial relationship that something happening in their life is ruining for yours, blah, blah, blah. That's sort of the dynamics of parasocial stuff, and as a creator, it can be pretty weird to be on the receiving end of that sort of parasocial stuff. I've gotten some, like, super strange emails, especially when I wrote about purity culture and stuff. I don't want to hear about your masturbation habits, people. I don't. And whatever spiritual guilt you're having over that or whatever, I'm not your pastor. I am not in a position where I can do that. Like, that sort of parasocial thing is, ugh, terrifying. But with conservative commentators, I've noticed how they use this parasocial relationship in order to make their points more clearly and to invoke specific feelings within their audience. Steven Crowder does this a lot. You can see it here right at the beginning of his video.
And look, I say this without a hint of hyperbole. They're coming for your kids. There's a 26-minute segment making the case as to why it's a good thing for children to transition, for children to get on puberty blockers, and it's an attempt to gaslight you. We'll get it. We have so much.
They are coming for your kids. This isn't hyperbole. He literally says, I say this without any hyperbole. So he is focusing in on the viewer. He is capitalizing on the parasocial you in order to draw that viewer in, to make sure that they are feeling the specific feeling that he wants them to in that moment. It is something that Alex Jones does a whole lot, and Steven Crowder is very clearly imitating him. You see Alex Jones, who does they are coming after you. This is part of America. This is, you as the patriot, blah, blah, blah. Crowder does does versions of this, where he takes an argument that John Oliver is saying and turns it around to, look, John Oliver, this liberal, is saying this about you. You are an extremist for having this reaction to trans minors. You are a problem. You see libs of TikTok do this a lot as well, where she will say, like, you are being called this. Look at what Twitter is saying about you, my audience. It's very clearly an attempt to make the viewer internalize and grasp onto that sort of group mentality that is being brought up.
Education policy says that students shall use bathrooms that correspond to his or her sex, except to the extent that federal law requires otherwise. You can go look at all these bills that he presents as just anti-trans bills. Again, the attempt there is to gaslight you, going, well, I'm not anti-trans. Because you're not I don't hate, hold on a second, I wouldn't support those bills, because you probably believe that it's banning trans people from public forums. These are very specific bills that were required precisely because of the kind of push that John Oliver makes. By the way, it's a live show here Monday through Thursday, 10 a.m. Eastern. No idea how long we'll be on YouTube, especially this. This is the third.
Notice how in that clip, he's talking about bills restricting health care for trans people, which is anti-trans. You can't do a restriction on one particular group and then say that you're not anti that group. That's just simply not how language works. But instead of arguing that, he appeals instead to his audience's sense of outrage. You are an extremist, according to the narcissistic trans people. You have a completely sensible reaction to being called a bigot and an extremist, and you should lean into that anger. That is the message that he is sending. The person watching the video, the fan of Steven Crowder, is encouraged to do their own research. But then Crowder attributes motive to Oliver that is not at all supported by any of the evidence. He doesn't want you to. Notice how he's drafting his audience in on this war on truth that he's telling. John Oliver doesn't want you to go do your research. He's turning Oliver into the enemy that you, the audience, now have to go prove is wrong.
It's the Census Bureau or local state sort of polling institutions, how different it is regarding geography, regarding the politics of the parents. Now, you can say that, hold on, it's a chicken or the egg, correlation doesn't equal causation, and maybe that's because those kids are more free because they were actually trans to be. Sure, we can have that nature-nurture conversation, but only if you acknowledge that there's a dramatic difference. He doesn't want to, because he doesn't want you to do the digging. Please dig through the references that I provide. Please go watch this whole video. I beg you, please do the research. All of it that you can. This is about the soul of the country.
The point here is to engage the listener in this emotional intimacy, to include them as the target of all these bad things that liberals are saying. If the liberals are saying that questioning trans people is bigoted, well, then you're a bigot. You don't want to be a bigot, do you? Look at the way these liberal people are harming you. You fearmonger.
Kid is casually dropping into an operating room because they just decided to get their uterus removed with the impulsive recklessness normally associated with getting bangs.
Yeah, a board of medical professionals like this.
That's a huge bitch.
You think that person's going to be unbiased? Who has openly said that they want to be more aggressive in interventional therapies?
That's the first female 5-star general you're talking about.
Yes. They didn't even say woman. They said female.
4-star?
Yeah.
Which is a biological term. And then, but remember, you were a bigot if you said, hold on a second, I think you're the one changing gender and sex. We used to use them interchangeably. Oh, you don't know the difference between sex and gender? Well, apparently the former vice president, Kamala Harris, and the entire DNC and Rachel Levine doesn't as well, because they refer to Rachel Levine as the first female, not woman. You bigot. Why would you try and change words?
The point of all this is to engage the listener in emotional intimacy, to include them as the target of all these bad things that the liberals are saying. It positions the viewer as inherently rational and validates their emotional reaction to being called a bigot, to being called an extremist, blah, 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 as though it is a rational one. It forces the viewer to choose the side with Crowder in this discussion. Well, of course I'm not a bigot. Are these people calling me a bigot for my reasonable views? Stephen says they are. And that's the entire argument. It hinges on the parasocial. It hinges on developing that anger within the audience, rather than actually making an argument. Again, he doesn't actually say that the bills aren't anti-trans. He just appeals to his audience's sense of outrage at being called bigoted. And that is the entire point of the parasocial appeal. It is designed to force team the audience into having this emotional reaction, into thinking that this emotional reaction is the rational one, and to be mad at liberals for not respecting that emotional reaction. You are the extremist. How powerful. Next, we turn to Matt Walsh. Matt. I spent most of 2018 trying to get purposefully blocked by Matt Walsh, and I was sad to say I was not successful. I kind of wish I was. I've just blocked him myself now, because I recognized even back in 2018 that Matt Walsh is the type of person who will be incendiary on purpose. He doesn't give a shit about how people feel when they react to him. He doesn't care as long as he can get clicks and likes. That's basically it. And as long as he can be a conservative voice. His arguments are not rational. Straight up. He doesn't try to make a rational argument, even though he will lean back on that idea that he is the rational one, that he is following the science. Delve more deeply into his work and have, 6 hours to devote to it. Jessi Gender put out an absolutely great series about his What is a Woman documentary and how he doesn't actually want to know what a woman is. Because the people he interviews are answering him. They are giving him an answer. He just doesn't want to hear it. He just refuses to hear it. He puts funny music over their answers because he has that agenda. When I sat down to watch Matt Walsh's videos, I found something interesting. He is capable of tempering his language. And so what he is saying, we know, is a deliberate rhetorical choice. Matt Walsh isn't particularly interested in the rational, but he is fully aware of what his rhetoric is and why he is making particular rhetorical choices. In a video titled, They Are Waging a War Against Truth Itself, you can hear him make those choices deliberately in how he talks about trans people. This is how he starts off the video.
So this weekend we saw Joe Biden promising a bunch of TikTok stars that he would pay for their abortions and make sure that every state in the union is sexually mutilating children. This is what Democratic desperation looks like. This is what they do when they're scared. They double down on their infanticide and child castration advocacy.
The thing about Walsh is that he's very aware of how language radicalizes and changes perspectives. He talks about the need for compassion combined with truth-telling, which is actually a little bit refreshing.
This is not a matter of trying to debunk or embarrass someone, certainly. I care about him. I do. I care about these kids who are being taken advantage of. I know a lot of them hate my guts. They think that I'm a horrible person. I'm a monster. And I get that. That's the way they see it. That's okay. But I care about them. That's why I care about the issue, is people like that who are dealing with something real, but it's internal. It's like something in his mind, something real. And if I had a chance to follow up with that student, I would tell him, first of all, that it's going to be okay. I know he's suffering. I don't doubt that. I know it. But it's going to be okay. He is okay. There's nothing wrong with him physically. He says there that he talks about he hates his Adam's apple and his voice, but there's nothing wrong with any of that. That's him. That's who he is. And there is nothing wrong with that at all. That's who you are. There's nothing wrong with who you are. The trouble is when your mind is not able to reconcile with who you are, or for whatever reason is not wanting to accept who you are. And so it's that struggle to accept that is the fundamental issue that we need to try to address. As I'm always saying, it is very much on our side, which is the side of truth, is very much a message of actual self-acceptance, of real affirmation.
Notice how he tempers his language when he's speaking about an actual, real-life trans person who is in the room with him. He's attempting to display compassion. That compassion is fake, because what he's ultimately advocating for is reparative therapy and consistently misgenders the trans person that he's talking about. But he's capable of recognizing that language and words have real meaning, and that they have impact on the humans that you're talking about when you make these arguments. He's not pretending to be in some completely objective, rational world where trans people don't actually exist. But that just makes it all the more insidious when he uses language that makes it clear that he wants people to view trans-affirming surgeries, gender-affirming surgeries, badly, and to view it with fear and anger. Notice again, he started the video by talking about sexually mutilating children. There is no world in which that language is objective and rational. That is emotionally charged, deliberately incendiary language. In another video, where he is talking about the conservative censorship on Twitter, He refers to top surgery as mutilation being inflicted upon children.
So, factual information about the mutilation that's being inflicted on children in this country by these so-called gender-affirming doctors, that factual information is flagged on Twitter as unsafe, and it could lead to harm somehow.
Mutilation is, in fact, one of his favorite words for talking about trans-affirming surgeries, for talking about the scars that I have. He refers to it as medical abuse of minors, butchery, sterilizing, castration, butchery. Butchery is also his favorite. He held a rally in Tennessee to stop mutilation. This language is designed specifically to frame healthcare in deeply incendiary terms.
And that's why we're still playing offense here in Tennessee. I've already told you about the bill filed this week, the very first piece of legislation in the session, Bill 1, which will ban so-called gender affirmation, quote-unquote, procedures on minors. And the media has lamented that our bill is among the strictest in the nation, and I will proudly admit that we are guilty as charged as far as that goes. Our legislation not only bans the medical abuse of gender-confused minors, but it also empowers the victims to sue those who are responsible for it. And what I believe this is an unprecedented step. The victims of this butchery will even be given the right to sue their parents. After all, parents who bring their children to doctors to be sterilized and castrated and butchered are the primary villains here, even more than the doctors, I would say. I mean, the doctor is a mercenary fraud, hurting children for profit, betraying his oath to do no harm. It's hard to get lower than that, but the parents somehow succeed as they are bound by an oath before God to love and protect their children. Whether they have said such an oath out loud or not, they are bound by it from the moment that their children are conceived.
I grew up in the height of pro-life evangelicalism in the 1990s. And one of the things that I learned very early on is that the way in which the emotional appeals to calling regular, normal procedures butchering and murdering work is that they incite and galvanize a base toward violence. The Operation Rescue movement of the 1990s put doctors on wanted posters, calling them baby killers, and referred to their offices as butcher shops. Yeah. Walsh is all too ready to call the doctors who provide gender-affirming cares mercenary frauds hurting children for profit, betraying their oath to do no harm. That is language that he knows from his experience in the pro-life movement to be incendiary, to inspire terrorism against these minority groups. There's no universe in which he would ever frame gender-affirming surgery as healthcare. He knowingly uses this to galvanize and incite anger, and we know that he does this because he is capable of not saying that. He is capable, when a trans person is in the room, of tempering his language, of speaking the truth with compassion, as he says, as he argues for. He is deliberately casting healthcare, again, care I've personally received, as mutilation, as harm. That's nothing but an emotional appeal. There is no universe in which reframing a surgery as mutilation is logical. The patient's perspective never enters into the picture. The patient's consent to the procedure, the patient's desire for the procedure never enters into his picture. His entire argument is based on emotion. That's all it is. And yet we see him showing up with Ben Shapiro to talk about how it is not emotional. It is logical and simple and scientific that we shouldn't be doing this mutilation to kids. Making it sound like doctors are pinning kids down and cutting off their breasts. He, of course, also calls drag queens groomers, saying that drag artists will get a sick satisfaction out of sexualizing children, and that the ideological project depends on destroying childhood innocence.
There's a reason why these people panic over the possibility that they may not be able to sexualize children anymore. For one thing, they get a thrill out of doing so. They derive sick satisfaction from it. And they're upset that this favorite pastime of theirs will now be taken away. But they also realize that their ideological project, their cultural agenda, depends on destroying childhood innocence as quickly and efficiently as possible. And they're going to find it more difficult to recruit children into their cult if they can't first corrupt them. And that's why they're upset.
Unlike Mr. Walsh, though, I've been to drag queen story hours, and they're fine. The biggest thing I remember from it is that this little, 2-year-old basically had the zoomies around the entire room and would not stop running. And the drag queens were just boggled by it. They were like, what is this kid doing? Oh, there he goes again. There he goes again. And then they read a couple books. It's like watching an Eddie Izzard show from the 90s, but, way more fabulous. But because Walsh is using the most incendiary language he can, he casts drag performers as recruiting children into their cult by reading them a children's book in a funny costume. That's not truth and compassion. That is deliberate incitement of anger against a minority group. After last week, I think we see where a lot of that leads. These arguments aren't rational. They are emotional. They are based on a dislike of trans people existing in the world, of gay people existing in the world, of queer people existing in the world, and then trying to post hoc find a rationality to support that. And the arguments that they make are not rational. They are based in emotion. They aren't supported by the science. They are based in emotion. That's simply what it is. Thanks for listening.